Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's on this rather grand, kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek question on should universities shift from evidence producers to co-producers. I guess the answer is probably sort of a bit of both, and we're already doing this a bit. But I think we want to dig into the detail of that answer and understand where we're at and where we might go in the future. The prompting for that question, and really why we're holding this webinar, is that a bunch of us here at Oxford in the Agile Initiative have written a report on this question and done a kind of literature review and discussion document looking at this question. And so this, in a sense, is a launch of that report. The report will be going live on the website if it's not already. A link will be in the chat very soon. Just to introduce myself, I'm Pete Barbrook-Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Agile Initiative. I'm a researcher at Oxford in the Oxford Martin School and the Geography Department. The Agile Initiative, which is kind of hosting this event, I should say a few words about. Agile is a 5-year program funded by NERC, quite a large program. Our aim is to rethink the role of research in policy and the connection between research and policy. We run a whole bunch of different research projects. Sometimes we call them research sprints, or quite often we call them research sprints, to try and actually experiment and practice with different ways of working with policymakers. And when I say policymakers, I mean that in quite a broad way, not necessarily just public policy. But as well as running projects, we also do lots of training and events. We do work to try and influence and inform the thinking of our funders, of the institutions we're part of. We work with the Central University here quite a lot. And we also do a lot of kind of meta work, what I would call meta work, really trying to evaluate what we're doing, learning from the experiments we're making at this kind of research policy interface, and trying to think more thoughtfully about what that landscape is at the research policy interface. You know, not everything needs to be super applied, co-produced research. So yeah, where does that balance lie? So Agile's been running for a few years now. There's lots of material on the website, so do go and check out the website. And yeah, probably the first port of call would be to find the report that we'll be presenting today. So the plan for the next 57 minutes, as it were, if we finish on time, we'll have a presentation first from a group of the key authors of the report, so you'll get a feel for what's in there. We're then going to have a kind of 15 minutes or so panel discussion with 2 experts who were not involved in the report, so give us a bit of balance, give us a broader perspective. And then at kind of 12:45 harsh, we'll open up for Q&A from everyone. And so I'm going to tell you this a lot of times in the next 30 seconds, but like, please do use the chat function, throw your questions into there, comment on others' questions or comments, use the thumbs up or different emoticons to react to the discussion in the chat. Just to do a quick introduction of the people who we're going to hear from today. So we have Mattia, Troiano, Nick Sidwell, and Joseph Boyle. They are researchers here at Oxford and led on the report. So they're going to give the presentation. We're then really lucky to have Professor Alice Oancea, who's a professor of philosophy and education and research policy at Oxford. And her research focuses in these kind of meta questions about the role of research. We also have Dr. Justyna Bandola-Gill, who's an assistant professor in sociology and social policy at Birmingham University, and again works at this interface between science and policy. So the work of Justyna and Alice was very important to us in the report. We cite them, so we wanted to get their perspective on these questions we're looking at today. So they'll be making up the panel we have after the presentation. So yeah, just to be really clear about the format, cameras are off for attendees, your mics are off, you're not going to be asked to speak to the whole group, but please do use the chat function to ask questions, make comments. We have Heather Stallard here, who's our communications manager at Agile. She'll be monitoring the chat and throwing the questions to me and the others towards the end. This session will be recorded, the slides will be available, so look out for those in due course. And yeah, one last time, please submit your questions in the chat. The livelier the chat, the more interesting the session, I think. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's going to kick us off with the presentation. Over to you, Joe.
Wonderful. Thanks, Pete. So the title of our report on which this webinar is based, at least the first section of it, is Impact and Collaboration in Environmental Research, Moving Universities from Evidence Producers to Co-Producers. And in that, we are trying to articulate some of the key issues in this space and illustrate that there are alternatives, many of which are already in use, and try and guide people towards those as things which we see as solving problems that are present in this space at the moment. Just a quick note on our team before we jump in, that there are more of us working on this than are present in the webinar today. And as an interdisciplinary team, we think that this has been a great project to work on, and hopefully something that has something in it for most of you, whatever space you're working within across kind of science and policy. So just to explain the structure for this webinar, which mirrors that of the report, which is available on the website, we're first going to look at the knowledge action gap and try and interrogate that a little bit with regard to research use in policy. So why is it that some research is not necessarily that actionable for policy and vice versa? And then we're going to look at methods to bridge that gap. What does it mean to bridge that gap? And what opportunities does that open? Following that, we will delve a bit deeper into the role of universities specifically, given that that's the space most of us are speaking from. And we'll consider the impact agenda as a tool of governance and as a way that university research is shaped by policy in a kind of bi-directional relationship. And finally, we'll come to honest brokerage and collaboration. So looking at that science policy pipeline and how that plays out in reality. That brings us to co-production, which we see as a means of collaborating, lots of different approaches within that, but a way to bring science and policy closer together and to have those two arenas working smoothly to close this gap a little bit. And within that, we'll look at some of the risks, the costs, and provide some helpful tips, we hope. So today is really going over a lot of the same content that's in the report in a lot more detail, and we would really suggest that if you find this interesting, that would be a great place to look for a little bit more information and specifics on it. And with that, I will try and tee things up with a bit of a story. So I'm sat here from Oancea at the moment. I'm on some field work. And just as a way of illustrating some of these questions that arise with these knowledge action gaps, because a lot of this is born out of these great big issues. I know that COVID-19 was something which really influenced the origins of the Agile Initiative, seeing the way that research and policy were interacting there. But also on these big environmental challenges. So things like climate change are the obvious ones that come to mind, or biodiversity loss and protection. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this approach is that it works across scales. So if you'll permit me just for a couple of minutes to tell the story of some protected areas in the kind of Orcadian seascape, where there is an abundance of marine life, really spectacular seascapes here. And one of the threats that was considered to that was industrial fishing. And there's ample scientific evidence to back this up. And it was translated into a policy context as what was called a highly protected marine area, which is effectively a fishing ban over huge stretches of the waters around these islands. And the science backs that up, but the way that it was implemented in policy doesn't reflect the full context that's needed to do these things well. As a result, there was a huge community pushback, and after years and millions of pounds being spent on this back and forth, the project was cancelled. And I think that whatever areas of policy or research we're working in, we all know of stories like this where the research and the context haven't quite been married together well. And we would like to pose co-production as at least one part of the toolkit needed to overcome that and make sure that we're using our time and resources effectively to produce actionable knowledge and informed policy. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Nick.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. If you could, lovely, thank you so much. No, I think that introduction with the Orcadian seascape there, that might well chime with a lot of you here. And I think you'd probably all recognise, at least to some degree, what we mean when we say that there is a general sense overall that the knowledge which is produced by environmental researchers somehow fails to deliver on its full potential for use by policymakers. And just to throw in a couple more examples as well, it's something that we see on a national scale, as well as in Oancea, the Climate Change Committee, who were writing just a couple of months ago, back in March, in their formal assessment of the UK government's response to climate change. They deemed it to be inadequate. It's their word. And in other words, what we are seeing is there's a clear gap between what we know from research findings and how that knowledge is used when formulating policies. And as Joe has illustrated, and to put another example to you as well, the same gap exists on much smaller scales. For example, as a researcher, Maria Carmon-Lemos and her colleagues over at the University of Michigan have highlighted multiple studies which show how research on water resource management routinely fails to break through to policy design. And what gets termed as a result of this disconnect, the knowledge action gap, has many contributing factors that we see in studies across the literature. Key ones include what you can call the structural and institutional differences between governments and academia, and falling out of this, the incompatible timeframes of much research on policy. Joe highlighted COVID as a source of inspiration for the Agile Initiative overall, and the rapid pace of research that took place during that time. Typically, research, as you will know, operates on a much longer time frame than policy development. And indeed, the cultural barriers between academics and policymakers. And some of these 3 points you might well have encountered yourselves, whether you're on the research or the policy side or somewhere in between the two. Now, the gap between research and policy matters because it influences those science policy interactions which lead to research informing effective environmental policies. Next slide, please. Thank you. Efforts to bridge the gap, of which there have been many, tend to focus on either improving the dissemination of evidence or developing greater scientific literacy in government, viewing this as a failing on the one side or the other when it comes to communication. While this is indeed an intuitive response, it does seem to make sense. It suggests that that problem is at its heart one of communication, and it is in turn based on deep-rooted ideas of academics over here, policymakers over there. But by focusing on clearer communication as our primary cause, we forget that there is a politics to scientific evidence, which is highly influential. We need to recognise that there is no linear path from science to policy. It's not just a case of making the message clearer. Scientific evidence is one of many factors influencing policy decisions, and its relevance varies a great deal across different phases of the policy process. And climate change adaptation policies are a very notable case in point. And it is also the case that many environmental issues are inherently complex. Issues such as climate and biodiversity are so far-reaching that they inevitably cut across multiple different policy priorities. So when we look at rationales for research use in policy, we need to look at the context, as Joe said at the beginning. Policymakers may use research because they are responding to a perceived risk, or because research fits into or usefully changes an existing policy narrative. That is, the research use is based on what can be termed its appropriateness or its meaningfulness. This is a very different idea to the one that research should somehow logically flow into policymaking. And it emphasises the institutional context. For example, who is it that is making use of the research? How are they resourced? What is their decision-making process? The policy context, what else is going on, and how politically sensitive is the policy area? And the spatial configuration, which is how readily might scientists and policymakers interact with one another, for instance, due to the co-location of staff or the proximity of one institution to another. Next slide, please. What we see in our work and in the report is that the inconsistent uptake of research by policymakers and the limited success of efforts to improve this is putting great pressure on universities as the recipients of public funding and as highly influential actors within this broader science policy ecosystem. And the pressure is felt through a governance focus on research, on impact via the Research Excellence Framework. And as Professor Oancea, who joins us for the discussion afterwards, has argued, using impact as a core measure of university research is intended to better align the outputs of universities to policy need. The impact agenda that falls out of this influences the shape and character of universities and, by extension, their approaches to research. And it gives rise to what we all experience, whether explicitly or implicitly, as impact cultures. Now, this is important because it poses an ethical dilemma for universities and university researchers. But typically, when it comes to convincing policymakers to act on research findings, academics adopt the role of what political scientist Roger Pielke calls the honest broker. The idea is that the broker is policy literate, but also policy neutral. It's the policymaker's responsibility to act on the research. The honest broker's role is to present it as useful, bearing in mind, of course, what we saw for the rationales of research use just a moment ago. However, making impact a central purpose for universities and researchers gives them a stake in the outcome of policy decisions, which raises a question: how far should a broker, a supposedly neutral, as far as that is possible, broker, go to convince policymakers to act on their advice? It creates, in other words, an important conflict of interest. And this is a problem because it poses a risk that we might create the wrong incentives for promoting this research into policy. And that can have an impact on how successful policies might be in the long run, as Joe rightly illustrated with the example from Orkney. Next slide, please. So if research is to be impactful, the idea of research on one side of a divide and policy on the other, with brokers mediating between them, needs to be rethought. The ethical challenge that we have identified needs to be addressed. And we argue in our discussion paper that we need to look beyond the honest broker model to more participatory and collaborative approaches. And if we put collaboration on a spectrum, as we have done on this slide, we might run from a pure scientist on one end through to participatory knowledge producers at the other. And what we have seen is that within the environmental sciences, the co-production of knowledge by researchers and policymakers is offering a way to increase the use of science in environmental policy. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mattia, who will now look into what knowledge co-production means in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for laying the foundation. So the purpose of this final part of the presentation is really to zoom in on knowledge co-production as a form of addressing the gap that has been outlined so far and that is extensively discussed in the paper. But before getting that, what I really want to stress is the way that co-production is understood across different scholarships or areas within this collaborative space and within the research space that could contribute to policy. And the way I want to stress it is in kind of a deeper form of engagement across these areas outlined in this table that already also in the discussion document. And what's interesting here is that emerges from starting from an environmental science perspective within climate change. We see co-production understood as still matching policymakers' needs of evidence within the policy cycle and development, leading on to environmental management, where there are efforts for redeeming that kind of local ecological knowledge within project and initiatives for managing environmental services, but also mitigation and adaptation projects. There's then sustainability science, where co-production kind of is framed as an instrumental tool. And the real purpose within this field and the way this field understands co-production is a way of bringing disciplines together and working towards the creation of knowledge, but also solutions that single disciplines working in silos would have not otherwise be able to come up with. So it's really as a form of addressing shared and commonly experienced environmental issues. The value of bringing in science and technology studies at this point is to consider then co-production also as a deep social transformational tool, and for the sake of assessing co-production knowledge from basically the cost spread out across community groups that are brought in the co-production table. So really understand how the sociological and political outcomes of co-production processes affect the different parties involved. And I'm gonna suggest you keeping an ear and an eye on the report on this strand of scholarship that has been crucial in informing the latest tips that we compiled at the end of the report. So you clearly see a line between this area of scholarship up until the suggestion on how better we can implement, or how successfully we can implement knowledge co-production that we'll get to in a second. And then there is public administration, which is crucial here because it's also the way the most practitioners understand and implement co-production. And this is a way of really leverage that multi-stakeholder approach to environmental policy, to bring in different affected parties together at the table and trying to kind of create knowledge and solutions that are centric to these users being affected by these environmental issues and experiences. Next slide, please. And the way we make sense in our report of co-production is through the typology offered in Chambers et al. These are typologies that kind of categorize and classify different processes of knowledge production in 6 different modes. And what I want to stress here is that the first 3 modes, so researching solutions, empowering voices, and brokering power, to kind of realist and scientific use of science and assumption of science. So the epistemological assumptions that are brought in the conversations within the realm of scientific research and realist approaches. And the differences across these 3 layers of modes of knowledge co-production is that if the first 2 speaks to the level of solutions and voices, so as a way of switching the voice from high stakeholders in the governance structure down to more local actors, the third, the brokering power, brings in a much more instrumental and solution-oriented component, which looks at key policy actions, so a way of developing key policy actions within the current system rather than just solutions per se to shared environmental issues. And what is key, I want to say, to take away from the latest 3, so the second half of this modes, naming reframing power, navigating differences, and reframing agency. I want to emphasize that these 3 strands of co-production should be looked as a way to look at the whole governance structure. So these 3 modes are deeply multi-level, and they speak and bring together at the co-production table high powerful stakeholders, both in the academia, the policymaking world, and NGOs landscape, and as a way really to look at those methodological and knowledge pluralism and social diversity at the table. And each of these modes bring about a specific key benefit when properly implemented. If the fourth mode aims at shifting power from high level to marginal actors in a rather hierarchical way, navigating difference aims at creating that non-hierarchical state of conversations, tensions, and conflicts more generally navigated up until reframing agency, where this kind of non-hierarchical environment then ends up regionalization of power and agency. So empowering local voices without entering into the space of tokenizations of marginal voices. And this is something that we'll get into the next slide as we go on. So can I have please the next slide? It's important to understand, as stressed at the very beginning by considering science and technology studies, that knowledge co-production at the end of the day occurs and takes place in those kind of same environments when knowledge production and science and of course university collaboration usually takes place. And this makes basically knowledge co-production subject to the same or similar risks and costs that wider knowledge production is subject to. Starting from the cost, we try to compile basically different costs and how these different costs are then spread out at the co-production tables across researcher practitioners and other stakeholders involved. And when we talk about all the stakeholders involved, is usually those groups of stakeholders that are brought in the table and in the conversation, specifically for the type of environmental challenge or problem or issue that we're trying to address, or in relation to the specific aim for which co-production is leveraged in that process. And as you can see, and I would invite everyone to have a look at the extensive discussion document where each of these costs is broken down. But what I want to emphasize here is how all the risks are, of course, at the core of the role of the researcher in these processes. Fewer risks are, characterize also the role of the practitioners, and even fewer characterize the role of other stakeholders. And this is not just because these weren't discussed, as mentioned here in the table through the legend, but it's also because the challenge, the cost associated with the different groups needs to be really understood in a subjective and project-based, process-based approach. So each project will, of course, have costs that each group experience differently. And this is key in bearing in mind when thinking on how best we can implement co-production. But jumping on the risk, and I would ask Joe to jump on the next slide. What we did here is basically categorizing and using the same typology as touched upon at the beginning that Chambers et al. Offer. And we kind of mapped them out, the likelihood of each risk to emerge when implementing one of these 6 modes. And the 4 main, of course, risks that have been categorized are also the same risks that characterize wider knowledge production. And these might be the replication of a traditional flow of knowledge from the producer to the user. The second one is the kind of lack of scarce knowledge and value pluralism. So the failure of actually facilitating that social diversity at the table and leveraging, working through that diversity without seeing it all as a way of blocking the process, but actually as a way of bringing in things that in a more traditional knowledge production way would have not come up. The third risk is the misrepresentation of marginal voice. And when we say misrepresentation, we also mean a tokenization of those groups, of those voices at the table that so far in normal and more ordinary collaboration spaces have been systemically neglected or not recognized. And this is particularly key also in informing what we can do to make sure co-production is implemented in an effective and successful way. And the fourth risk is basically the reproduction of techno-managerial solution. And this is usually witnessed in a way when the mitigation and actually the valorization of those different values, so of that knowledge and value pluralism that characterize co-production tables fails. So when the mitigation of those tension and conflicts and the negotiation around those are rather failing, we see the reproduction and the creation of a much more technocratic and techno-managerial solution like normal and traditional knowledge production for environmental policy leads to normally. But all of that, cost and risks, which are there, and we did great efforts in mapping them out. We also try to learn from those and from the great literature that we went through. So yes, please, next slide. And the 2 key things we want to emphasize is the structures that we can keep in mind to facilitate co-production and make sure that the benefits that co-production can realize are not hindered by those kind of risks associated with wider knowledge production. And this is the kind of a reflexive approach to knowledge co-production in the first place. And what we want to emphasize is the multi-stakeholder and disciplinary organizations, which the Agile Initiative seeks to do, and the wider Oxford Martin School really does. So bringing across disciplines and outside the space of the academia interested parties together to work. A second type of structure is leveraging those informal networks to sustain what we call a social communication of co-production. And this is a way of bringing co-production within policy development right at the forefront and at the beginning. So as a way of stimulating interested parties to come forward at the very beginning of shaping those research projects and to support policy development across the stage as much as they can. Also to make sure that knowledge co-production remains and keeps being validated within those established structures. Then we have what we call an established community of shared practice and evaluation. And what this means is basically creating an iterative loop of practice, an ongoing conversation between practice and theory, and make sure that each is reflected into an improvement of each other. And the final bit is in relation to the funding. So what we invite to think about is a flexible and adaptive funding strategy, which can also adjust and facilitate this iterative loop of practice that we've just talked about. On the second level, Joe, you can swap slide, please. Yes, we have 4 key points to stimulate this reflexive approach. And this is for the whole team and more specifically within the facilitation team. And we invite in considering deeply your own positionality and how this positionality also affects the kind of negotiation table that we can facilitate through co-production, and as a way of recognizing the political character of the environment where co-production takes place, and how our own positionality and these hidden agendas, what we call hidden agendas, can then affect very practical things in the process, starting from the people you invite at the co-production table up until how you facilitate the process and wrap up and present the outcomes of the processes. And what we want to stress and emphasize here is a fruitful consideration and negotiation of these conflicts that can emerge from the social diversity, and working towards an empowering recognition of actors, so kind of a recognition of equity around the table of equally valued voices rather than hierarchical structure. And I think on this reflexive approach, our presentation is closed, but again, we invite going back to the main discussion document where each of these steps are much more broken down and should be able to make much more sense to each audience type here today.
With that, I will come back with a summary just of what we've covered here. So we have looked at the knowledge action gap and how it emerges through structural, cultural, and kind of temporal tensions within that process of universities and policymakers interacting. How, when left unbridged, this gap limits the scope and impact of both research and policy, but that impact in research has come to shape the research agenda, and it limits the extent to which universities can genuinely engage as honest brokers in this policy cycle. We've looked at co-production as a powerful means of collaboration and as a way to start to close this gap. And yeah, we'd invite you all to look at our discussion paper and the shorter summary paper for a little bit more information on all of that. So we hope you enjoyed that summary of all of that, and I will hand back over to Pete.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. Yeah, just leave that slide for one moment, just to flag to people. I don't want to go through this list now in detail, but at the beginning of the document is a kind of list of questions that, having written the document, we found ourselves asking or that we would want to put to others and answer ourselves. So it's a kind of list of attempting to be provocative type questions about to help people engage with this topic, because I think co-production and this issue of where's the balance between research and policy work is a hard thing to engage. It can get very conceptual, it can feel difficult to pin down, and so those questions I think are a useful starting point. Okay, so let's stop sharing screen so we can see everyone, because now I wanted to break out for sort of 10-12 minutes to chat to Alice and Justyna. I have a few questions I wanted to put to you about the report and the topic. I think I'll start with Justyna, if I may, and then Alice, you could answer second. But first I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the presentation. I know you had a sneak peek of the report, not a huge amount of time to digest it. So, I mean, do you have any kind of immediate reflections or things you'd like to emphasize on this topic? Yeah, maybe Justyna first, and then Alice.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the team for a very fascinating discussion, but also very insightful report, which I thought captured very nicely the diversity and kind of complexity of debate around co-production, both in the academic literature, but also grey literature. I think two types of reflection that came immediately to my mind when I was both watching your presentation right now and reading the report was about the importance of definitional issues. I think this field is actually very rich with different categorizations and definitions, and I know myself I'm guilty to that. I added to this different types of co-production, but I actually think it's quite important in this area because co-production might mean different things, and more importantly, it can happen on different levels. So we have a very narrow project-based initiatives that are labeled as co-production, but we can also think about co-production as a systemic issue on how science and policy or science and politics are interacting with each other. And obviously, this diversity and richness of definitions and meanings of co-production can then either enable collaborations across different disciplines, but also across, research and policy and practice. And I think your report was quite useful in actually capturing a quite useful way of talking about these definitions that I think might be helpful to then identify and establish what we mean. And I think it is important to kind of point to the take home message coming from it, that when we are working in a co-produced way, it is important to firstly establish what do we mean by co-production and what we're actually trying to achieve here. I think the second immediate reflection is about the politics of co-production, and I think we are now in a kind of completely different world than when the literature on research knowledge policy gap first emerged, in the 1970s. I think increasingly what we deal is not just knowledge practice gap, but kind of polarized epistemological systems across communities. So it is a much more entrenched differences, not only in whether we have influence on policy as researchers, but also in what do we mean by research, how valuable research is, how do we value research in policy, and how different groups are actually doing that. And I think this aspect actually of co-production is, in my view, underdeveloped. So we don't talk about the specific politics of co-production in practice, which might lead to overemphasizing the value of co-production. I'm obviously a huge proponent of co-production, but I think we should definitely discuss who has a say and how who has a voice in co-produced settings actually is a political statement. And we know that there are actors who are actually trying to leverage the co-produced settings. There's a literature on how tobacco industry is actually leveraging the multi-stakeholder settings in order to promote their own ideas. In my own research, I had a situation where researchers developing a poverty indicator in a co-produced way actually noted that the local government had a huge stake but also huge influence on who's invited to the room, which in the end resulted in the fact that co-production ended with solutions that were actually beneficial to the government rather than were delivered in deliberative, public engaged, co-produced way that would kind of flatten the knowledge and power hierarchies that we would hope for to achieve from co-production. So I think this issue of politics highlights the importance of actually looking how do we set co-production initiatives, who is invited, who gets a say, whose voice is included, but also what kind of agendas and political goals actors involved in co-production have, and treating everyone as a kind of political actor in a way. I'm going to stop here and let Alice share her views.
Thank you, Justyna. Yeah, Alice, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also from me for the excellent presentation and the discussion paper. So I'll just make maybe 2 or 3 comments that build on the points that Justyna made as well. And you'll see that they don't add up to a critique of the report. So they're made entirely in the spirit of companionship. So one's about the conceptualization of the knowledge action gap. One's around who the policymakers are. And the third one is about the different fields that have contributed to conceptualizing co-production in a meaningful way. So on the knowledge action gap, so I just building on what Justyna said, I want to highlight a contrast that I think has been used a lot, overused, to underpin oppositional view of policy and research. And that's the relationship between praxis and theory, philosophically framed. And I think this quite artificially has been seen as a dualism, and has led to associating policy with situated, concrete, committed, operationalized practice, and research with generalizing, abstract, critical theorizing, and so on. And the view implies that the key difference between policy and research would be in terms of their kind of relative normative and epistemological purchase on both transforming and understanding a specific domain of social life. And for me, this polarized view, to use Justyna's term, is limiting, both in relation to policy, because it does not acknowledge its policy's capacity for systematic reflection and conceptual development, and for research, because it does not properly acknowledge its own capacity for being conducive to beneficial and sustainable and democratic action. And then one implication of this oppositional polarized view is that policy and research may be seen also as ontologically discrete, which results in a topography of praxis and theory as being bounded institutionally and organizationally. And then work at the interface will then be described as bridging, for example, for the purposes of research-informed policy, or also, brokering metaphors fit into that as well. So I do agree with you in your kind of sense of caution about kind of both models. And I think institutional topography is such a limiting categorization device, right, which breaks down pretty easily. So in my own work as well, I've really tried to move past this oppositional view, and I think you do that nicely in the report as well. So on my side, I would argue more for a concept of shared spaces for dynamic research, policy, practice, community nexuses, which are systematic, reflective, and considerate in their own ways of working. And these are shared features of research, policy, and practice alike. So it's a more kind of positive starting point. And I think co-production of knowledge is a good example of how these can come into action. So a lengthy way of making my first comment. You'll be pleased to hear that my other 2 are much shorter. So my second comment is about the scope of policy and policy making that's included in your review. And then note on potential differences between contexts, because I think, in many policy domains, there are documented and very strong differences and inequalities between different levels of policy making, be it local, national, regional, global, and so on, between different sectoral policy makers and community actors, but also between different countries. So policy actors from different countries in relation to how a policy problem is framed, how agendas may be set, how policies are formulated, what implementation might be imagined to look like, what indicators may be acceptable for evaluation, and so on. And the differences between the highest and the lowest income countries, I think, and regions are a clear example of that. So the question in relation to this for me and for you is whether and how, especially when we're looking at issues and problems of global impact, understandings of co-production need to take into account the more specific issues around inequality, trust, and power that arise from such differences, which are, I think, are inherent to a non-homogeneous view of policy and policymakers. And my final comment, and I think this also links to Justyna's work, is just to flag up the field of higher education and education, within which I've also spent some time working, which I think also has contributed some kind of quite unique takes on co-production at the micro level and at the macro, more paradigmatic level that I think Justyna was hinting at earlier. And I tried, but I won't dwell on that now, I tried to kind of fit these into one of your tables and try and reflect on what it might look like in terms of understandings and aims of co-production, so we can have a conversation about that at some other point.
Thank you, Alice. Really useful prompts and suggestions. I'm very keen to get to the questions in the chat because our chat was quite lively, and we're going to do that, I think, in about 1 minute. I just want to put one more question to you both, Justyna and Alice, and ask for a very, very short kind of 1-sentence answer, just to force ourselves to be specific. I'm always interested in this question of what's the balance. You know, I talk to people about the Agile Initiative, and I see some people roll their eyes and say, oh, not everything needs to be applied, not everything needs to be co-produced with users. Oh, you know, we don't. You know, where do you think that balance is? Is this a small endeavor, or is this a mainstream endeavor, and everything we do in environmental research should be co-produced unless we have an extremely good reason? Like, yeah, how do you draw that balance for how much we should be doing of this type of work? Justyna, maybe first.
Yeah, so I think I'm a little biased here because my background is in science and technology studies, and a classic STS answer would be everything is co-produced, right? So there's no clear boundary between science and policy and politics. To a degree, what we research, what gets funded, how the universities are structured are already influenced by the complex system around it. However, I understand that, you know, the answers that people would like to hear, that STS people would, you know, really wave their hands at, is, you know, in a specific kind of project-based way, how much research should be co-produced. And I think the answer would be, it depends. I can see, and it is kind of supported in the literature on co-production, how co-production that is aimed at transformative change is something completely different than co-production aimed at instrumental direct changes in policymaking. And the risk I see here, if we focus on only one way of co-producing research that only supports narrow policy questions that produce actionable solutions, then we're going to miss out on the opportunities for co-production to have this transformative effects that I think in environmental sciences, but also in other areas, including higher education, health, and so on, that we would hope to achieve from co-produced projects, which would be this kind of systemic transformative change. So it's not a matter of how much of a co-production, but rather what types of co-production shall we support, and obviously that would be shaped by institutional setting and the impact agenda and so on. But I'm going to stop here since it's been more than 1 sentence, but yes.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. I'm going to use that line. I think everything is co-produced anyway, so let's think about it more carefully. I like that. Alice.
So I assume this is more of a provocation than actually an invitation to quantify, right? So I'd say mandating co-production as a very specific toolkit and specific approaches is not the way forward, because we still want to recognize it, but within a research environment and culture where epistemic diversity and a very broad range of models can flourish. Having said that, I think they are important. Co-production, co-creation, and other associated practices, they're important. They can be fundamental in terms of kind of how knowledge gets generated, but they may not be the full picture once you operationalize them into specific toolkits and kind of methods. I think the principle and the method are two different things. So having said that, I think you know, where to use those more kind of concrete, more specific approaches to co-production depends on the aims of the research. And we need to be very quite clear about that, you know, exploratory, critical, transformative, practical, and so on. It depends on the nature of the problem, how much research there has already been into it, the level of multidisciplinarity required, the balance of different forms of expertise and knowledge is needed, the extent to which this is a space of trust already, or it's a space of contestation and inequalities, the diversity of interests and meaning making underpinning it, and so on. Then in practicalities of cost, human relations, relational capacity, and logistics. And I would say also there's a crucial question there, which is, where can it be done responsibly? And this is, I think, ongoing work that I'm also involved in terms of kind of really developing the framework for responsible engagement and knowledge exchange and impact that may also be relevant to work that describes itself as co-production. And how can we avoid work that has the right levels, follows the right steps, but it's still exploitative and extractive?
Thank you, Alice. Okay, so lots of food for thought there. Heather Stallard, our communications manager, I think has had the hardest task of the day, keeping track of the questions and trying to digest them and feed them through to Justyna, Alice, Nick, Joe, and Mattia. So yeah, Heather, over to you. Which questions have boiled up to the top for you?
Yeah, so the first one is why should research be expected to inform policy without engaged specialists on both researcher and policymaker sides? So this is about petitioning between research activity and the focus for policy and knowledge exchange professionals. And they added, I'm thinking of recognising specialist skills and assigning focus, which might help relieve some of the tensions described.
Thank you, Heather. Anyone feeling particularly bold on that one? I put an opinion in the chat earlier where that came in. Anyone else would want to respond to that one? Feel free to jump in or raise your hand.
I think very, very briefly, this is one answer. It's not necessarily a complete one or applicable. They're caveated in all situations, but it's important to recognize the underlying social contract, if you like, for research, where the funding comes from, the fact that it's public funding, the fact that universities have a role in broader society and to a degree, I think, need to continually legitimate that role. And one of the ways to justify public expenditure, one of the ways to legitimate a role is to demonstrate through societal impact the relevance and applicability of their research. Now, not every piece of research is going to be directly applicable, so that can look quite different in different circumstances. But it should always be, I think, a consideration for all pieces of research.
Thanks, Nick. I think one other comment I might add to on these kind of petitioning of roles issue, I think there's a real tension there, and I'm not sure where my opinion lies, if I'm honest. I've held some of these roles where knowledge exchange was kind of in the title, and it puts you in a strange situation as a researcher, I think, and you worry about researchers kind of outsourcing their impact work, somehow delegating it. But I also think you need the expertise and the understanding of working with policymakers and understanding the policy world that we shouldn't expect every researcher to have. So I'm really interested in that role, those type of roles in Agile. What we've done, I think, is not rely on individuals with those kind of job titles, but have an entire project set up to have lots of those people and have an infrastructure around the project to support researchers in their impact work. Heather, next question.
Okay, we had a few questions on working with communities. So someone would like to hear more about how research policy co-production can be done with community context involvement and meaningful engagement with those affected. Someone else said, could you comment on how policymaking could engage with lived experience, testimonies? And then a couple of others said that trust building is crucial and that's something, we need to factor in the time for trust building. So could someone also talk about how we can stimulate that trust and build in time for it?
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, I kind of interpret this somehow as a question about when the co-production is done with communities that maybe are not not policymakers who are empowered and already thinking in these ways, maybe. Anyone got any reactions to this topic, this question?
I might jump in just for, I see Alice, please.
No, happy to wait.
I'm just going to give a quick snapshot. I think something that turned out to be really useful from a facilitator perspective before jumping in the research side of things is really having that kind of grounded network within these different communities. And as we were mentioning in things to kind of, bear in mind when I stress the kind of positionality and our entanglement with wider, university world and public world as such, so with different communities, understanding how deeply your positionality is seen from that community, by having a direct link with someone from that community that can mediate directly with you, I think that becomes an incredible strength for the whole project. So having that kind of direct link with what we could call potentially a climate champion, part of the community that you're not directly part of, becomes very, very powerful from a practitioner perspective. At least I don't know if you want to build on that.
Did you want to come in on that, Alice, or was
Yeah,
that?
no, just to add that I agree. It's we have a very diverse epistemic agents, each of whom comes with their own positionality. They see that as positionally objective knowledges, which they bring into that interaction. How do we articulate those positionalities in ways that are then communicable across different horizons of understanding in trustworthy ways? And that's a challenge that I think becomes even more complicated when we combine participatory policy models with co-production models that kind of rooted in research as well. So you get citizen science and community engaged policy and so on. And when you get to those situations, you get that very kind of complex web of trust and mistrust that needs to be negotiated there. And also, I think in terms of actually apportioning merits in those interactions, that's a problem, because accountability kind of led systems, both in policy with impact evaluations and so on, and in research with reporting impact and the like, kind of push us in the direction of taking credit for certain things. But where change and knowledge evolves collectively and through distributed exchanges and not from the targeted efforts of individuals, all of those claims become very problematic and can very seriously undermine trust, particularly when working with vulnerable, marginalized communities, or with communities that have very unique epistemic perspectives and worldviews, which they contribute to that interaction, but perhaps from lower positions of power in that interaction.
Thank you, Alice. Nick, did you want to come in?
Just to say very briefly, there's a partner project to this report. There'll be a webinar later on in the month which looks at public participation, which, if you're interested in what Alice and Mattia have been saying, Pete will flag, but would be a good one to join as well.
Absolutely, yes. I'll mention that as when we close. I think hopefully we've got time for one more at least. Heather, any others that you felt bubbled up multiple times, or anything that caught your eye?
Yeah, so there's one about sort of short projects and funding. So one is that, how can we sort of tackle finding the time to train for all of this and include it in our research in short-term funding grants? And then someone else said, has the team considered opportunities for flexible funding opportunities, beyond the typical research pots? So from a policy perspective, co-production or co-design is actually focused on the policy practitioner relationship rather than the research policy relationship. And what are your thoughts on how we can tackle that?
Yeah, brilliant questions. Yeah, time, massive issue. We worry about that a lot in Agile. Of course, we haven't cracked it. And we see a huge plethora of different pots of money that people can apply for that this kind of work can fit into. Any immediate responses, any really helpful suggestions or solutions? I hate the word solutions, but what's the way forward to fit this into short time span projects, to fit it into where are there funding opportunities for this?
This will be a nice flag for the full report. There's a citation in there on researchers who have been looking at this question and how to engage with funding bodies to promote co-production, and there are some hints and tips that they include in their papers around engagement with funding partners on this. So that is sort of about halfway through the full report. Look out for the citations there. I'd recommend those.
Thank you, Nick. Maybe Justyna, and then we'll bring things to a close.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I don't think I have a solution to offer, but I think an important aspect of research funder role in funding co-production is also in terms of how actually research funding impacts not only on research practices and research topics, but also on the practices in terms of knowledge exchange and impact. So there's actually very clear evidence showing that the modes of research funding actually would impact on how researchers value different forms of interactions and what forms of co-production then engaged in. And unfortunately, so far we've seen this push for instrumental modes of interaction between research and policy, research and practice. So I think there's a huge lesson here for research funders in terms of supporting diversity of different practices in terms of co-production, beyond just looking at the instrumental and short-term results in terms of very narrow policy impacts.
Thank you, Justyna. Yeah, I hope one of our kind of provocation questions in the report actually pushes at exactly that point for funders. I think it's important that we draw things to a close and keep to time. We shouldn't go beyond what people have said, even though I know there's more to be said that we haven't covered. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Alice and Justyna for joining us and really enriching the conversation. Nick, Joe, and Mattia, of course, thank you for walking us through the report. Big thank you to Agile and NERC for supporting the work. And yeah, just to flag that that webinar that was mentioned on the role of publics and deliberation in environmental research and policy. I've put the link in the chat. That's in a few weeks. It's on the 25th of June. So a few weeks away. So do sign up for that if that topic's of interest. Otherwise, please get in touch. I think all the speakers, I'm sure, are happy to be contacted. Emails are very easy to find online. Check out the Agile website, and yeah, please keep in touch. Thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully see you soon.